I'm Professor Sharon Bessel from the Crawford School of Public Policy at the Australian National University. The Individual Deprivation Measure is an individual measure of multidimensional poverty, which is sensitive to gender and able to identify which social groups are affected by poverty and how. It assesses multidimensional poverty across 15 dimensions. In 2018, a research team from the Australian National University, working with an Indonesian survey organisation, SurveyMeter, undertook an IDM study in South Sulawesi in Indonesia. We surveyed over 5,600 women and men over the age of 16 years. The results provide rich insights into the way poverty affects people's lives, and it shows that gender matters. To respond to poverty effectively, we need to know how it impacts differently on women and on men. Since the 1990s, the idea of the feminisation of poverty has been much discussed globally. This is the idea that more women are poor, that poverty impacts more on women, and that women are becoming increasingly poor. Our research does not find that women are always and consistently poorer than men, but it does very clearly show that poverty is gendered, and gendered roles and responsibilities shape women's and men's experiences of poverty. Let me explain how. In Indonesia, we found that both women and men experience poverty, and often very deep poverty. Let's take just one dimension of the IDM, food. Food is a basic human right and essential for life. It is an essential dimension of multidimensional poverty. The IDM draws on the food insecurity questions developed through the Food Insecurity Experience Scale and introduced by the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization in 2014. Food deprivation impacted on almost 1/4 of people, and both women and men experienced some form of food deprivation. But those experiences were different. Men were more likely to report skipping meals and eating less than they thought was necessary. This was particularly the case in urban areas. Women were more likely to report anxiety about running out of food, and this was especially the case for women in middle age, between 25 and 59 years. So what's happening here? It's likely that men's patterns of employment impact on their ability to access food during the day. Women's responsibility for caring for and feeding their families, and the anxiety created when they cannot fulfil this role, likely contributes to particular forms of deprivation. It's interesting to note that women in middle age were most likely to be worried about running out of food. But young women were also more likely to be worried than were young men. This indicates that similar gendered patterns are playing out across generations. Women, particularly in rural areas, were more likely to report not being able to eat healthy or nutritious food, suggesting patterns of prioritisation within the family when food is scarce. In regard to the food dimension, both women and men experience deprivation. It is certainly not the case that one or the other is doing better, but their experiences were different. Now let's take a look at the health dimension. Health problems were widely reported. Between 30 and 40% of women and men reported at least one physical health problem. In Pangkep, just over 20% of women and men had experienced recent health problems that prevented them from undertaking usual daily activities. In Jeneponto, the proportion was just over 1/4. Men were more likely to report an illness or an injury in the 4 weeks prior to the survey, while women were slightly more likely to report a longer-term illness or injury. Mental health presents particular challenges for both women and men. While men in Pangkep were more likely to report feelings of depression, women in both districts, particularly those in the middle-age cohort, were more likely to report daily experiences of feeling worried, nervous, or anxious. Anxiety was also a particular issue for young women. Both women and men in rural areas were likely to experience mental health issues. The IDM Individual Survey asks about health problems such as headaches, dizziness, and difficulty in breathing as a result of exposure to smoke and fumes from cooking fuel. This is an issue that is heavily gendered, and in both districts, women were far more likely to report problems than men. In Jeneponto, 22% of women reported health problems from cooking fuel, compared with 14% of men. And finally, the data from the time use dimension of the IDM is heavily gendered. In both districts, women spent more time in paid and unpaid work combined than men. In Jeneponto, women typically spent 11.5 hours per day in paid and unpaid work. That's 1.5 hours more than men. In Punkep, the imbalance was greater, with women spending 12 hours per day in paid and unpaid work, which is 2.5 hours more than men. Women were far more likely to have a child in their care while performing other primary activities. Almost 42% of women in Jeneponto had a child in their care while performing other tasks, compared with just under 12% of men. It's important to note that men also worked long hours, but women's time burdens were greater. In Punkep, the widest gender gap in time spent in unpaid work was in the youngest cohort, 16 to 24 years, with over 53% of women, compared with 36% of men, undertaking both paid and unpaid work. This suggests that unequal time burdens are being transferred across generations. So if we look at just 3 dimensions, food, health, and time use, we don't see a simple picture of women being poorer. What we do see is poverty shaping and constraining the lives of women and men, but in rather different ways. The data from our IDM survey in Indonesia also tells us how gender interacts with other social characteristics to determine the depth and nature of poverty. Women in remote islands off the west coast of South Sulawesi were especially deprived, and in most dimensions. We see that older men over the age of 60 years are especially prone to social isolation. And we see that living with a disability deepens deprivation on almost every indicator for both men and women, but women with a disability were most deprived. It is crucial that we understand these intersecting patterns of poverty if we are to respond in a way that reaches and supports the most vulnerable. While poverty is shaped by gender, there are some aspects of poverty that relate to biology and reproduction and are specific to women. These aspects of poverty are very rarely measured. Indeed, the IDM is the only mainstream measure of poverty that assesses women's deprivation in regard to prenatal care, access to contraception, and access to sanitary products. The family planning dimension of the IDM clearly reveals that women overwhelmingly carry responsibility for contraception. Men were more likely than women to report having no need for contraception. In Jeneponto, 45.8% of all women reported personally using contraception to avoid or delay having children, compared with 19.8% of men. In Punkep, 43% of women personally used contraception, compared with just over 8% of men. The health dimension asks women who are currently pregnant or have been pregnant in the past 12 months whether they accessed prenatal care. In both Jeneponto and Punkep, access to prenatal care was very high, with the exception of women in the Punkep Islands, where 78% accessed prenatal care, compared with over 94% in other regions. The IDM clothing dimension asks about access to sanitary products. In Jeneponto, almost 10% of women reported not using any sanitary products during their most recent menstrual period. Among women with a disability, over 20% did not use sanitary products. In Punkep, just over 6% of women reported not having access to sanitary products during their most recent period. Women in the islands were 5 times more likely not to use sanitary products. The findings from the IDM study in Indonesia provide deep and nuanced insights into the ways in which poverty plays out for women and for men across different age groups, across geographic location, and depending on disability status. Our findings suggest that poverty is gendered. While women and men both experience poverty, and very deep poverty, they experience it differently. Sometimes those differences are due to biological or reproductive roles. Very often, those differences result from gender roles and gender responsibilities. Responding effectively to poverty requires assessing which groups are vulnerable and how. The IDM findings from Indonesia provide the kinds of assessment we need. They reveal the gendered nature of poverty and the ways in which women and men experience poverty and need support if poverty is to be alleviated. Our findings demonstrate the importance of individual measurement of multidimensional poverty to inform policies and programs in our efforts to end poverty and to ensure that no one is left behind.